Moving on, I'm wondering, how does everyone feel about the term self-advocate? And do you think that it describes what you do?
I went through phases in how I felt about the word, and what helped me was learning the history of it. Because when I expand outside of um, autism advocacy and activism into the larger IDD and intellectual and developmental disability activism community, I am humbled. I went through a phase where I didn't like the phrase self-advocate because it felt like I was going out and trying to fight for everybody's rights, and then getting told that what I was doing was the equivalent of asking for a glass of water. And that was really upsetting. But then when I found that the people who started this movement back in the 60s were very, very excited to be called self advocates. And the reason was because they weren't allowed at all to speak for themselves, not even. I want a glass of water on Tuesday, like not even at that level. I want to go to the park, nothing, and because other people were advocating for them and advocating in ways that didn't even ask them. It was completely without input. And so being a self advocate was such a point of pride. And the more that, and we're getting to this in a later question, so I'll just touch on it, but the more that I saw how self advocacy expands so far beyond the self, and that it is uh, the first venture onto a journey of um, of unfolding for everyone. The more I came to be really proud of the term self advocate, because still today a lot of people are not allowed to get a taco or go to the park or anything, um, not for themselves, not for anyone. And for me to denigrate the term self advocate would be to move backwards in our progress.
Thank you. You just described my relationship with the word exactly. Who else wants to talk about this?
Amanda, she, her. And I'm gonna, like, when think about self-advocacy, I also had a bad relationship with self-advocacy for a while, like Matt said. And and now I'm just like, people can show up the way they want and use the words they want to use, as long as they're getting their needs met. Because people use different words, we just need to be able to accept them and understand like how they're moving themselves forward in the work that they're doing. And the only reason I may get upset with people using the word self-advocate is when non-disabled people use it, and it does become something to represent all people with disabilities, and I know we'll get into that. That's when it gets problematic, because I don't think everyone in the disability community is a self-advocate or an activist. I think it's a skill set that people learn over time. Amanda, she, her, complete.
Thanks. Who's next?
There really seems to be a persistent problem with people assuming every member of an oppressed group must be an activist, when that's not at all true and shouldn't have to be true either. We should just be allowed to live. But self-advocate, I don't think it's a bad term, and I think self-advocates understand it, but neurotypicals, they seem to have some trouble with it, and sometimes it gets used against us as evidence that we are speaking for everyone or something, and and supposedly is supposed to just mean that we advocate for ourselves alone, when really self-advocates do advocate for our entire community, which is different from speaking for people. But that's just manipulative, holistic twisting of words like they do, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the term ultimately. And whatever we called it, they would find some way to use it against us because that's what they're good at.
Yeah.
I just resonate deeply with everything everyone else has shared.
Thank you all. Great answers again. So, for the philosophical among us, which I think is everyone here, what happens at the intersection of prejudice and self-advocacy?
What happens is we're not taken seriously, and all of these stereotypes about people like us are used against us in every malicious way to discredit our advocacy and our activism. Because people who want to religiously cling to the status quo, or people who outright want people like us to disappear from the world, will use anything to their advantage to discredit us and turn the public against us.
Amanda, she, her. I think one of the things that I've seen in my career is I felt like I've been like given roles of leadership, but never like actual power to make decisions around the work that I do. And that has been part of my struggle in my career since since I've started. And that can be traumatizing, and that's a form of ableism and discrimination. And if if self-advocacy is done in that way, then it can be hurtful and damaging for people. Amanda.
I feel like one of the biggest things that happens at the intersection of prejudice and self-advocacy is radicalization. That anyone who has to any degree begun to use and exercise the skill set, as Amanda so eloquently put it, of self-advocacy, when we encounter prejudice while acting as a self-advocate, it builds up a feeling of injustice, whether it's prejudice directed at us or prejudice we're witnessing being directed at someone else. And this radicalization is what leads to that expansion of the exercise of self-advocacy that I referred to earlier, where we might have started as a self-advocate because we needed accommodations to go to school or to go to work, or taking it back to, we wanted to go to the park and nobody was taking us to the park. So we became a self-advocate to let people know that this is what I want to do with my day today. That the injustice builds and builds, and the more you experience it and see it, the more you notice it, and it accumulates, and causes this radicalization in which the self-advocate just naturally, in my experience and what I've observed in others, just naturally wants to expand that circle of concern and start advocating for everybody to have the right to do with their day what they want to do, everybody to have the right to work and go to school. And it keeps expanding, and it's why so many disabled self-advocates and activists care so deeply about systemic oppressions against other people, like white disabled people like myself care deeply about dismantling white supremacy and becoming collaborators with activists who are fighting on that front. And every oppression and marginalization begins to be seen as a piece of a bigger picture, that there is so much that needs to be addressed and fixed in this world, that prejudice and that drive for self-advocacy just can infinitely expand. And so it's a way that something really good can come out of something that's really fundamentally evil. And that is what is so beautiful about being a self-advocate.
Well said. Thank you.
I want to like piggyback on that and also talk about some of like the challenging things that happen. And that's this kind of atomization that I think a couple of folks were talking about on the earlier question, where people kind of assume that when you become a self-advocate, that your circle of concern doesn't expand and that you're always just talking about yourself. And this way that it causes people to kind of discount what you say, or to have an unwillingness to take a systemic kind of perspective, because they're saying, oh, you're just one person and we want everybody to be heard. We want everybody to feel respected. But they're not thinking about the power differential or the reasons that someone becomes a self-advocate, or the things that one kind of puts at stake when advocating for oneself and one's community, and kind of accidentally weighs things the same or like inappropriately. And like, I agree with Maxfield that it is like one of the greatest things that I feel like this movement and part of my life has given me is like this expansive lens through which I can understand so much of what we're going through in the world, and how to just meet my fellow humans. But at the same time, I've had a lot of experiences like Amanda was talking about, where people are really, really ready to take advantage of that. And that has, I'm almost 30. I'm just now reaching a point in my life where I feel like I'm somewhat developing a very stable support system. And when you don't have that, it's really quickly easy to find yourself burning out or becoming frustrated or disillusioned, because of the prejudice that you encounter, or the slowness of a lot of the progress that we have to do, or just being in spaces where, like Amanda was saying, where people talk about self-advocate like it's a type of I don't even know. I remember being I'm a community organizer. I'm all about getting people to things, getting people in places together. But I will never forget being part of this planning one event where a parent organizer from an organization that will remain nameless kept saying, well, I have this many self-advocates. We're going to get we're going to bring this many on this many buses, and just wanting to be like, she doesn't think, just feeling intensely that on some level she doesn't quite think that we're people. And that can wear on you.
Excellent points all around. And that leads very well into our next question. Sometimes you hear the term self-advocate used as a synonym for person with disability, and this is usually from people in disability adjacent professions that I hear this. But is there a difference? Should we be viewing all disabled people or people with disabilities as self-advocates?
Just want to retweet that thing that I just said. And say that, like, if non-disabled professionals use that term for everybody, it runs the risk of countering so much of the important history that Maxfield educated everybody on a moment ago about the origin of self-advocacy and the term being about honoring people's choice. And so if you call everyone that without knowing that they have chosen to take on that, to label or recognize themselves as part of that movement, then I think that that's not a great thing.
Disabled people really like to find any way to talk about disabled people that does not call us anything we want to be called, or even call us disabled people, don't they? So I think a lot of them caught the term self-advocate and heard us using it and thought, oh, it's a great opportunity to have a new word to call us that isn't disabled. And that's not what it means at all. But that's the way the holistic mind thinks, I guess. I think it's really dismissive of really both sides of this, because it's like saying that just like existing as a disabled person automatically makes you an activist, which is not something most people even consented to. It's also kind of like discrediting the hard work that self-advocates actually do by saying that all we really are doing is just existing and being disabled.
I think, oh, go ahead. Someone else.
Sorry. Amanda, she, her. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just gonna agree with all what you guys have said. I don't really want to add anything to it. Yeah, and I think that, self-advocacy, activism, community organizing, that's all a skill set, and that's what that is. And I think it's really important to recognize that, and yeah, so I'll leave it there. Amanda, she, her completes.
And what Amanda said is a perfect springboard for what I want to say, which is that it is dangerous. It is actively dangerous to dilute the word self-advocate into just a euphemism for disabled, as Winter referred to it, how people use it. And the reason is because I completely agree with Amanda that it is a skill set. I also believe it is a skill set that all disabled people have a fundamental human right to have these skills made available and accessible, and continually so that everyone who wants to learn the skills of self-advocacy has that opportunity, because a lot of people have been really suppressed. Some people, like, intentionally and maliciously, most people through what gets called benevolent ableism, where we're treated in a very ableist way by people who believe they're doing it for our own good and to protect us to help us, and all it does is silence us and take away our autonomy. And to say that all disabled people are self-advocates is to let everybody in the world off the hook on their fundamental obligation to make self-advocacy skills available to disabled people. Because if we already automatically are self-advocates, well then how would we possibly need any kind of training or support or mentoring in the area of self-advocacy? So it's actively dangerous for that reason to just use it as a euphemism.
Well, and because like denial of those skills and like silencing people, as you said, it actively puts people at risk for exploitation, for abuse.
Yes, this I think is one of those word tricks that sometimes get played on us, because self-advocate does have a micro individual meaning too. When a person is first learning to, express, I don't want tomato juice, I want orange juice. In that sense, there are a lot more people who you would call self-advocates, but you know that that's not what people mean when they say, I have a bus full of self-advocates. All right, well, let's take about 5 minutes and come back at 1 minute after 2. Let's talk about advocacy, self-advocacy, and activism. Are they the same thing, or what's the difference?
There's a blurry line between self-advocate and activist where it can be hard to say if something is one or the other, but to take a more reductionist view that allows us to separate them into the categories in a very like broad strokes kind of way. Advocates and advocates, as opposed to self-advocates, advocate for people, help people. Self-advocates are advocating for themselves and people similar to them. And advocacy as a whole is a form of signal boosting, of amplifying issues to bring awareness, understanding, and change. And change falls into that blurry line where it starts to blur into where's the difference, because both want change. The activist is doing something more actively manipulating that change, by like from the root of the word, taking an action. So like things like public speaking and letter writing can be both. They can blur across the lines, but an activist is usually doing something like some form of protest, whether it's out in the street protest or burning your book on the steps of the Social Security Administration building, or artist activists who write plays or dance or perform as a way of getting the signal boosting of advocacy out into more of an action arena. I had another example I wrote down. Oh yeah, scholar activist. That's another one, because it's this fusion. There are scholars, and when a self-advocate becomes a scholar, they often will start to blur across that line and become a scholar activist, where the research that they're doing and writing about is doing more than just amplifying and signal boosting the issues, but actively suggesting ways that things could change. But beyond that, it is a very blurry line, and people can be both at once.
Amanda, she her. when I think about activism, I think about like systematic change, almost like a more of like for the not necessarily, but like for the collective good of my community. So I may not be I may not be and it's still really blurry, but it's more of the collective good instead of the individual good. That's and activism to me is a more radical term because it means like I may like do something illegal to prove my point, or I may like, you know, make people really uncomfortable to prove my point. Like it's and it depends on what audience I'm with, depends on what terms I use. Like if I'm writing a grant for my organization, I use the word advocacy. But if I'm talking to my people, then I'm actually doing the work around. I use the word activism. It just depends on who you're trying to work with, who is your audience, who are you trying to who are you trying to change in your work. Because I work in a lot of day programs and a lot of like institutions, and in most spaces I don't use the word activism. I use the word advocacy because it's more digestible and it's not so scary to the able-bodied people that are still making those decisions in those institutions. But I know that I can interchange those words at any time depending on who I'm talking to, and my disabled peers know that too. We know that we have changed our language depending on who we are working with. Amanda, she, her. So. Complete.
I think because the word activist has so many different meanings in different contexts, in recent years in activist circles, we've seen a further division between activist and organizer, which is the term I'm more likely to use for myself in most contexts than activist or self-advocate, because it really describes the kind of skill set that I have and the work that I do. Self-advocates really should be doing some kind of activism. Everybody who claims to support disabled people should, because activism can be just about anything, and anybody can do some form of it. So I don't know in what context I would draw a line between the two, but otherwise that self-advocate is a more specific term for a specific type of activist or organizer who's a member of the oppressed groups that they are organizing for.
I related to what Winter was sharing. I'm also more likely, I tend to mostly describe myself as an organizer as well, both for the reasons that they shared, but also because I feel that it's really important to highlight the very relational nature of the work that I strive to do. I think that as everybody else has spoken to, and rightly so, that the line between self-advocacy, advocacy, and activism is blurry, and it's because they're connected. It's not that, you know, any one is better or preferential to the other. It's that they're all kind of in relationship with each other. There's a place for all of these things. What organizers do is try to bring people together to help make things happen so that we can create change as well as just talk about it. And I had something else I was going to say, and I forgot. Oh well, I apologize.
Well, if it comes back, we'll give you a chance to say it later.
Thanks. At
Yes.
that, I love what people are saying about organizer. I hadn't put a lot of thought into that word before. I really appreciate that. A word that I use a lot is facilitator. I specifically facilitate certain events, and I view part of my purpose in the disability community in a larger sense as a facilitator. I've come to a point in my own activism where I feel like I can't go any further unless I'm helping other people up to follow their dreams and live their potential. And so I'm always trying to help people find good platforms for their voice, and community, and support, mutual support among groups of people. And so I really love the word organizer, and I think a lot of what people said about that feeds into how I view my own role as a facilitator.
I remembered what I was going to say. What Max was sharing made me think of it. So it there's what the learning about the relationship between advocacy, activism, organizing, kind of like the expanding consciousness we discussed earlier. Early in my adulthood, when I was really coming to grips with being autistic, with the way it wore on me, how differently the world treated me, my therapist told me the first thing that you need to remember anytime that you experience discrimination, anytime that somebody treats you badly, you need to remember that you're not alone. You're not the only person that this has happened to. And that there's something that we can do about it. And finding your people and finding what you can do about it. Like just that framework of it, like it gave me the ability to see the problems and the challenges that I was encountering in a much bigger way. That, like, yes, of course, to get through my day, I have to advocate for my own needs. But then, as others have said, I have a responsibility to my community, to almost as if giving tzedakah or tithing, to spend a portion of my time doing this for the community, doing this to make sure that it is bigger than just my own life.
Thank you, Micah. I think that ties up the conversation really well. There were so many different perspectives there, and they were all very valuable. The next question is, how has self-advocacy benefited you or your community? And by community here, what I mean is your disabled or otherwise marginalized community.
I when I was looking at this question ahead of time and thinking about things, the first thing that popped into my head is a community a little larger than my own marginalized community. Some years back, a group of autistic self-advocates slash activists, we were very upset about Google autocompletes. When you would say autistic people should, it would say just terrible, terrible things, or even just autistic people, and the autocompletes would be horrible. They'd be ableist and hateful. And to counter it, we did an activism movement called a flash blog, where everybody wrote blog posts titled or with the phrase autistic people should, and we coordinated that they would all be released on the same day. And then I had recently gone through a class in how to write press releases, and I said, I've got a great idea. I'll write a press release for this flash blog and we'll get even more attention for it. So I wrote this press release, and a reporter got the, someone else had some connections and they got it put out on the wire, and a reporter got that press release and interviewed some of us and called up Google. And Google didn't want to talk to them, but Google also got kind of scared because now reporters are calling them. And Google did something they had never done before, which was change their algorithm in response to a protest action. And to this day, if you go to Google and type in Muslims should or Black people should, or almost any identity, there's a couple of identities that aren't in, like they don't seem to recognize that asexual and aromantic people are an identity. So you'll still get autocompletes for some identities like that, but almost every identity, autocompletes are disabled. And we did that. Autistic activists did that. And I saw an interview with a woman who had written a book that's on the New York Times bestseller list. I sadly forget her name. I forgot to look it up before this because I didn't realize I was even going to mention it until the second. But she said that she didn't know what happened. She said that she had seen, Black girls this and Black girls that in Google, and suddenly it disappeared and she didn't know why. And we are why. Our activism did that for everybody.
Amazing story.
Amanda, she, her. Most of my activism now that I do is around people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, knowing about their rights around guardianship. And so right now I'm helping multiple people either change guardianship or like being able to or like remove their guardianship. And this has become a passion of mine. And I didn't even know it was until like 8 years ago. I didn't even what the system was. And there's so much stuff that is not like public, and pushing that to be more public is one of the things that I'm going to be working on. The folks that I work with at the Independent Seekers Project, that's one of the things that we're going to be pushing for. And especially one of the other things that I've seen in my work is around like sexuality and dating. Because again, I get a lot of our folks who have guardians and then they want to go out and date and learn about sex, but there is not a lot out there. And so we're pushing around those forms of discrimination and things, which the work is so slow. And another thing that we're working on is just talking between different advocacy groups and making sure we're on the same pages is one of the other focuses that we're trying to get, we're doing at this time. Amanda, share, please.
Bev, I'm doing a little bit of dissociative amnesia. Can you repeat the question?